Broadcasting live from the Business RadioX studios in Houston, Texas. It's time for Houston Business Radio. Now, here's your host.
Hello, Houston. Trisha Stetzel here, bringing you another episode of Houston Business Radio. It is my pleasure, and I'm so excited about having my friend. And by the way, he may not remember this, but we met way back in 2008 in BNI. My friend, Mark Taylor, is on with me today. Mark, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you, Trisha. Of course, I remember. I remember a lot of details about that because it didn't take long to anyone who's been around you knows that you're a shaker and a mover. And I picked up on that quickly. And do I recall correctly, we were starting a BNI chapter over in Pearland and you foolishly volunteered to help me. Is that?
Foolishly. Yeah. So I think that was a couple of years into, so I was a member in the League City.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
And then I got involved and started helping with the Pearland chapter, which is still doing amazing, by the way, and is led by some amazing people. And then I was also involved in trying to get one over on South Belt off the ground because we had some people out that way that were interested in networking as well. But that's not what we're here to talk about, Mark.
Okay. All right.
I want to tackle this idea of HR outsourcing. And I happen to know that you're pretty well versed in that area. So what do you know about HR outsourcing, Mark?
Well, I got to tell you something. Maybe I've never told you this. I have an animal science degree and a master's in agribusiness. And so I was actually in that field for a number of years after I graduated from college. And a friend of mine called me one day and he said, "Hey, I just went to work for this company. They're growing." And he said all this. He said, and they're hiring. Would you like to consider going to work for them? And he told me it was an HR outsourcing company. And I said, "Terry, you do know I sell livestock feed for a living," which is what I was currently doing. He goes, "Yeah." And I said, "What in the world has that got to do with that?" He said, "I'm telling you, it's not about that. It's about, I know you and you're the kind of people we're looking for. Come in and interview." And I did. And so my point is, you don't have to have a degree in this. It's like anything you can learn. And I did. And the first couple of years, I learned a lot about just how HR outsourcing. What does that mean? And why would people do that? And so forth.
Okay.
So that was back in 1991, and I'm still involved in the industry today.
Wow. All right. So long time in this industry. And before we started recording today, you were telling me how many business owners, business leaders aren't even familiar with the idea of an offsite HR department. I'm using your words because I thought they sounded cool. So can you describe what it is that HR outsourcing does for a business?
Yeah. And let me just start with this. When you meet people, some of the first things they ask you first, of course, what's your name and where do you live and what do you do? But I mean, what do you do comes up pretty soon in the conversation. And I learned that when you say HR outsourcing, typically it's amusing to me. Typically people will nod as if they have any idea what you're talking about, which I learned they do not. I mean, it's rare that I find somebody who goes, "Oh yeah, I know all about that," and they can have a conversation with me. And so my point is twofold. One, if you ask 10 people randomly, what is HR, human resources, I've learned you'll get likely 10 different answers. And they're all elements of it, or not. I mean, it's just not one of those things where if you tell someone you're a banker or a chiropractor or a plumber, they have an idea of what you're talking about. But so not only are people unfamiliar with HR outsourcing by and large, they're not even real clear just what the whole gamut of what the scope of what HR is. And particularly we're talking about as an employer. And so that's my challenge right off the bat is how do you describe what you do in a short period without boring them to death or giving them multi-paragraph answer. So, but let me answer that. Um, my clients have one thing in common, whether they're white collar, blue collar, large or small. My clients have the one thing they have in common is that they have employees.
Mm.
And many don't really stop and realize that what that means is they are, like it or not, in the employee business. There are literally thousands of regulations and requirements and expectations that government does a great job of adding red tape to employers and expecting them to know and do certain things, many of which, if you are not in compliance, there are penalties. Focusing on the fundamental things. You, Tricia, if you were to be an employer, that you would have to address, and whether you and many times people will, well, they'll know. It's like sitting down deciding to just work on your taxes tonight. Very few people actually look forward to that. So this is a thing that's easy to put off. Entrepreneurs, business owners are really excited about their business, understandably, and they're not inclined to be motivated to check out all things HR. There are exceptions, of course, but that's the general viewpoint on HR and on HR items. And just to be clear, I'm talking about things as simple as, of course, producing payroll and the associated payroll taxes, keeping up with those. That's an element of it. And then there's when you hire somebody, there are ways that you can and should hire, and ways that you can't and should not. How do you know that kind of stuff? There are issues that can arise in the workplace. I gave Tricia a raise. I didn't give Valerie a raise. She's mad. So maybe it's a loss. I mean, there are suits that arise out of this. Discrimination, gender discrimination, racial discrimination, sexual harassment. All those things that, again, don't often happen, but when they do, people are ill-suited. It's never happened before. It's like if your house burns or you have a car wreck. I mean, if you've never had that happen before, you're completely at a loss for, what to do next or how to confidently work through that. So there's benefits. Employee benefits are a big concern with employees, and rightly so. There's compliance and safety and regulatory things that just unfortunately unfortunately, many times those things go unaddressed, and everything's fine until something happens, and then it can be devastating. It could be business ending, depending on the nature of the issue.
Yeah. So, Mark, I want to make sure I heard you right. Did you say that all of those things that you just talked about are part of what you bring to the table as an HR outsourcing partner?
Yes, exactly. Yes, the idea is this. So I've described a familiar scenario for no employer listening to this would be in the dark about this. They're at some level aware that there is a business of being an employer. Um, and so then you have to decide, well, how are you going to handle that? Here's how many, and my clients tend to be small business. I'm going to say generally, probably 90% of my clients fall between 25 and 100 employees.
Okay.
So that's my target market, because they have enough employees to finish every sentence I start. I mean, they know what it's like to deal with employees, and yet they don't have they don't have really an HR department. What they like to do, this is what most people do. They want to hire an employee and say, "You're our HR manager. Good luck. I don't care. Just do it." Make sure that in this field of HR landmines, make sure that we can navigate through it without stepping on one. See you later. And they step out of the room and go back about managing their business. And the sad fact is, although I would probably do that myself if I didn't know an alternative, there is no one person who is an HR specialist,
Mhm.
any more than there is a doctor who is an I can do it all specialist. I mean, my goodness, there's probably 200 different professionals from the top of your head to literally the tip of your toe, and they're all specialists. Well, it's that same way in HR. There's too many elements to reasonably expect anybody to know how to do it all. And so, again, that works until you get something happen that's beyond the scope, the expertise of that person who is the HR manager, which is thus the advent of HR outsourcing. And the idea is pretty simple. And you're right. I always tell my clients, I want you to imagine that you have an offsite HR department. When we enter into business, HR changes for you. And it's as if maybe it's offsite. Maybe you can imagine if you had a second floor to your building or an additional floor to your building, and that's HR. You seldom see those people, although you can. Most of the work, it's not necessary that they be in your office, in person, speaking with you. They are performing their HR task, whether it's acquiring attractive benefit programs or handling your HR, or handling your unemployment claims or work comp claims or whatever it may be doing. Or maybe it's
Mhm.
just compliance, making sure that if OSHA were to visit, it's not going to be a bad day. We're prepared for them. We're aware of them, prepared for them, and it's not seen as a threat. So, short of having your own HR department with people who specialize in these elements, the idea of outsourcing your HR to an HR company makes a lot of sense, because then you can. Let me give another example. A lot of my clients will have accountants, but they probably all do. Very few of them have one on staff 24/7 or 40-hour a week, because they just don't
Right.
have the work to keep them busy that long. So they meet with their accountant. Same thing with their insurance person. There's certain professionals that are vital to their business, but they don't need to have on staff. They just need them periodically.
Mhm.
And so, instead of having an HR person or looking for an HR person, like I just described, what about outsourcing to a company who is fully staffed in all of these specialties to be able to support that business on all these different elements?
Yeah, so important, Mark. And, there's a big difference between, you mentioned payroll companies. There's a big difference between just having a payroll company to do payroll for you and having fully outsourced your HR department, basically, and having this offsite HR department. Can we talk about the liability? Because I think that's really important. You talked about all of the services that an HR outsourcing business can provide to these business owners. What about the liability? So I say, "Hey, Mr. or Mrs. Admin person, you're now my HR person. Go do the thing." And they have no idea what they're doing. So the liability lies with me and that person, actually internal to my company. But if I hired somebody like you to come in and help me with all of my HR needs, where's the liability fall there?
Well, that's a good question. Um, you're right. And that's often the case where somebody is confronted with an event that happened relative to with their employees, or maybe a regulatory, whatever it may be. You like to be able to say, well, I mean, I just didn't know. And that never flies. There is an expectation, if you are an employer, that you have certain expectations and obligations that you must address. And of course, one of those is you've got the liability and responsibility for the people who work at your business. We've talked about a lot of the responsibilities. Liability could just be for injury, or for actions of employees. There's lots of liability. So, to your question, one of the huge, I think, the big advantage to outsourcing um, to an HR outsourcing company is that you can address that very topic. For example, Um, and there are companies that you can hire to do HR admin, and they will produce your payroll for you. They'll produce maybe your employee handbooks. They'll produce unlimited documentation and so forth, but they're producing it for you. And once they have, and you paid them, they're done. They have no liability. They're just producing that for you.
Mhm.
And I'm not referring to that in our relationship, in our arrangement. We have an arrangement or utilize a concept called co-employment. It's been around for decades, and it's simply said it works this way. I'm going to assume that you're an employer and that you have 35 employees, and you have the responsibility and liability that's inherent with that. Our contract introducing this concept of co-employment works this way. We will delineate those items in the contract that you are totally responsible for. And those are the right of control, the daily control of the employees. The hiring, the firing, and the direction of those employees is completely on you. And that's, of course, you're agreeable to that because we don't know how to run your business. And you do. So we're expecting you to do that. On the other end, all of the items that we are committing to by contract will be delineated. And those are many of the things we've already talked about. Responsible for payroll and responsible for, we without going into a lot of length, let me just say that we will delineate the responsibilities that we are liable for and responsible for. And then there's third category of tasks, and those are items that we are jointly responsible for.
Mhm.
Meaning, if we're going to produce a safety program for our client, it's incumbent on the client to implement the safety program. So if by contract we are to do that, and yet the client were to take and just pitch it in the corner, in case somebody wants to come by and see it one day, but in the interim there is an issue involving safety that results in liability. There's a claim. Then in that case, we would be have performed our role in producing that, but the client failed in applying it. So that's an example of a shared responsibility. And so what's important is that you delineate those in the contract so that both parties will know what they're solely responsible and liable for, and both parties will know what they're jointly responsible for. If it sounds like a partnership, it is. And what makes it a partnership is the employee base. So no longer would we consult with you about your employees. We would consult with you about our shared employees. Rather than standing on the side of the train track and you're laying on the track and we know there's a train coming and saying, if I were you, I'd get off. We're actually laying on the train track with you going, we need to get off of this thing. So there's a commitment. There's a difference in commitment level, whether you're advising and providing services or you're participating in the risk, which I don't need to tell you, that's the critical element here. And that is choosing the right businesses that they're going to offload liability, and they've got safety run amok, and they've got employee morale problem, all kinds. It's a mess, and they just want to know, where do we sign? Because I'm going to get this off of my desk and onto yours, and it doesn't go. That conversation doesn't go long. You can tell. It's not hard to tell the kind of clients you're looking for because you leave tracks in the sand. There's documentation about your history with as a business and particularly with employees. So those are a couple of real fundamental elements of how this works.
Okay. Very important, right? That you're assuming the risk alongside of the employer or the business owner, right? I think that that's huge because, oh, by the way, many of us small business owners had no idea, number one, that this was a thing. Maybe some of you did,
Yeah.
maybe you don't, right? But also really leaning into the liability that I have as an employer, right? holy cow, wouldn't I like to partner with someone who would take that risk off of my plate, right? Or share the risk.
Share the risk. Yeah. So it's like I mentioned earlier, a landmine, a field full of HR landmines. You can't see them
Hmm.
unless, so you need probably an HR landmine detector and diffuser.
Yes.
And, and so, but that's true. And you can say that about many different disciplines, many different professions with, in this picture is inviting the right people to the party. Because when you have people who are aligned with you in the way you regard employees, and they're more than just office furniture, we really want this place to be a place you can work for a career if you choose.
Mhm.
And you don't have to leave here for lack of benefits, or you don't have to leave here because we're um, just not legitimate in whatever way you want to describe it. We certainly want to. In fact, I will just tell you, because many of my clients are small businesses, one of their biggest fears is losing employees to bigger companies, maybe an hour drive from home, but they have good benefits, or they have good, frankly, they have good HR. They're stable. And,
Mhm.
and my message to our clients is you don't have to do that anymore. Rather than
Mhm.
settling for the second or third or fourth tier of available employees out there, you can go ahead and recruit the number one tiers, many of whom would prefer to work for a small local business for a variety of reasons. And you no longer have to say, well, because we're small, we just have to take the, accept the best we can get because we offer an inferior workplace. Not anymore.
Yeah, I love that, and it really does lift up those smaller businesses to be able to compete with those other larger businesses where employees may think that they can go and get something better, right? Bigger, better,
Yeah,
fast.
absolutely.
Yeah.
And you can't blame employees for doing that. It's very common. No one, I mean, everyone in the American business culture knows or assumes smaller company, less to offer.
Yeah.
And I've known people who work at a smaller company knowing that they don't have big company benefits. And I'm not talking about just like insurance and 401ks and dental and vision, but just the benefits of working for a small company. Um, and yet they work for less because they like the culture of a smaller business. Well, and
Mhm.
so the good news, as far as I'm concerned, is you can maintain the culture and you can also maintain those quote big company benefits, extending beyond just what I just mentioned, but just the literally the benefits of size
Mhm.
without having to be big to get it.
Yeah, that's fantastic. So, Mark, I would be remiss if I didn't say to the audience that's listening today, if they wanted to reach out to you because they want to know more, they happen to be a business that has 25 to 100 employees. And what other things should the listeners be listening for to make a decision on whether HR outsourcing is for them?
Great question. The first thing I would want to do is have a conversation.
Hmm?
And whether that's in person, it's probably best in person, but that's not always possible. Because I want to find out if this is a good fit. I learned a long time ago, sometimes no business is better than some business, depending on the kind of business. And so, as I mentioned earlier, I got to do a good job of inviting the right people to the party. And so that's going to take a conversation about what is it that's prompted, why do you want to talk to me? What's
Mhm.
going on? What's your frustration? What are your issues? And then it may be that we can't help you.
Mhm.
And I'll need to tell them that. It may be that we can help them, as I mentioned earlier, and I can't get out of there fast enough. Their business is burning down from an HR standpoint. But is more likely the case. There are many great businesses out there who are doing well as far as their businesses go, but they're distracted, maybe even impeded by some HR issues because they just don't know. They just don't know what they don't know.
Yeah.
That's why I need a plumber to come over when I have plumbing issues because it seems easy, but I don't know. And I've got the same tools in my toolbox, don't I? Right. And so that's why if I really am looking to interview someone to find out if what is HR to them?
Okay.
How important is it to them? well, I want to have that conversation. So really, to summarize that, the next step is I would want to talk to them to find out if I think they're a good fit for us and we're a good fit for them.
Okay. Yeah.
And so those conversations tend to go in the direction of their need.
Yeah. Okay. Well, and it's personalized, right? They may not need everything that is in the basket. They may need a few things that are in the
Yeah,
basket.
that's a good point that you make. In fact, I liken this in this conversation that I'm having with folks because it's all virtually always exploratory. I do at times get people who are maybe using an outsourcing and they're familiar with it for one reason or another, but the majority of times this is all new to them. And so that question comes up. Well, do we have to participate in everything you offer? We've already got benefits through my brother-in-law, and I'm like it or not, I'm not changing that. I'm married to his sister. Uh, so the answer to that is think of this offering as like a buffet. Anyone who's ever been to a buffet knows that you don't have to you don't have to like everything on the buffet. You can choose what you want,
Mhm.
and that flexibility. So that's great. If someone says, "Well, I really just want a slice of payroll and a cup of coffee," well, then they don't really need us, and I need to refer them to a competent payroll company. Why would I try to talk them into the full meal deal when they clearly said, "I just want a slice of payroll and a cup of coffee"? So that again is part of that first conversation, and that is it's not unlike going to the doctor. The doctor can't look at you and say, in most cases, I know what's wrong. They say, "Well, tell me what's your issue, and I'll tell you if I can help you."
Mm.
And that's just the basis, I think, of not only good medicine but good business.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. I've got one last question for you as we get to the back end of our conversation today. Mark Taylor, tell me a success story from your business or a great client story, something that's memorable for you.
Woo, I could tell you a lot of it. In fact, as I think about that, every single client comes to mind when I think of making a dramatic difference because it truly is a big difference in how they do their business. And I can think of times when people called me and said, "Man, I'm so glad we did this because now when we get to the employee in the interview, the initial interview, the hiring interview, and when they ask me, do you have benefits?" And I used to hate that question. Now, if they don't ask that, I can say, "Aren't you going to ask me about benefits? Because we got that covered." But specifically, I'm thinking of a client who was in construction, and he had a work comp claim that was really complicated, and it was large, and it was one of those potentially business ending issues. And because our employees, our shared employees, were covered on our work comp policy. Yes, he did have to tell us the details of what happened. And then beyond that, the paper trail of our documents and our contract says you need to talk to us about this. And for us, it's a routine thing. Doesn't mean it's not catastrophic and horrific, but it's routine. We handle these. Our compliance and um, that section of our business takes care of that on a routine basis. So you can imagine he was extremely relieved that he still had stress of the whole issue, but he knew that we were handling the comp claim for us, not for him. I mean, when I
Mm.
say us collectively, it was,
Right.
and it I don't know. I can't say that it saved his business. He will.
Mm.
He was. He sent me a lot of clients, a lot of prospects after that because that people who knew him knew about that, and they of course want to know what happened. And he's like, "Man, if you're not outsourcing this stuff to somebody who can slip in the driver's seat for you on this, you're crazy." So that's one that comes to mind. That was a longtime client of mine, both before and after that issue.
Yeah, I bet. Okay, Mark, if people want to have a conversation with you, what's the best way to connect?
The best way is to call me on my cell phone. I am what you would call an independent representative. I don't represent any one particular company by contract. I do by choice, though. I only usually keep one or two, maybe three companies in my quote briefcase. And the reason for that is I'm picky about who I introduce my clients to. I want them to have a personal relationship with these people, not just a personal relationship with them. So for that reason, before we even get to that, the best thing they can do is just call me. Let's have a conversation. I want to know about you. You're going to want to know about me and the company and all. And it may be a one conversation and we're done. It could be, well, just not now. Maybe the timing isn't right. I don't know, but have them call me. I love to talk to small business people and especially love to liberate them from just this thing that hangs over their head, this mysterious HR obligations and responsibilities that they have. I think we talked about this earlier. Know me long enough or well enough to know that a frequent tagline that I use in talking to people is, if you're in our business is really none of your business. And that sounds a little snarky, but if you think about it, nobody will say, no, that's not true, Mark. I got into this business so I could hire and manage employees. It's only your business if you're in my business. And so it's probably a good rule of thumb to outsource whatever you can that someone else can do better so that you can focus on what you actually do to generate revenue.
I love that. Thank you for being on the show with me today, Mark. This has been
my pleasure.
Yes. And all of the information, how to get in contact with Mark, will be in the show notes. So if you're listening or watching, please just point and click and have a conversation with Mark. And I happen to know that Mark Taylor is very well connected. So if he can't help you, he probably knows someone you can connect with, which is another benefit of having a conversation with Mark. Thanks again for being on. I appreciate your time today.
Tricia, my pleasure. I always enjoy talking with you. And so thanks for inviting me.
Absolutely. And that's all the time we have for the show today. Join us next time for another exciting episode of Houston Business Radio. Until then, stay tuned, stay inspired, and keep thriving in the Houston business community.